Thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it. I've never done a talk in 45 minutes or 30 minutes, so I usually go a lot longer. But we're going to try and do that tonight. Be good. The title of the talk is Thoughts and Forms. Thoughts into Forms. I think that's what it is. And the title is, in a way, what each of the works I'll be showing, and I'll be showing in numerous stuff over the last, I think, decade, or almost 10 years of stuff. And I think that's generally one of the main concerns I have, and maybe it's one of those big concerns about art in general, or producing something in general, is how do you turn a thought into a form, and what happens to that thought when it gets translated into a physical space and takes on this dimension of reality, sort of when fiction becomes fact, and what happens when that fiction becomes something that takes up space, that can be walked around and can be encountered and can be thought about differently and independently of that person who made it, which is me. And so I'll do a little sort of background, which leads into maybe how I'm going to talk. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, in Canada, which is in the far west. And Calgary is a city of, I think, just about 1 million people now. And in art school, I studied drawing. I was in the drawing department, which is kind of like majoring in reading or something. If someone, like, it's kind of absurd. But the drawing department was this sort of magical dumping ground for people that didn't really want to sort of be medium specific, because there's like painting departments and sculpture departments and very sort of like largely developed departments. And the drawing department was this thing that you could just kind of go into if you wanted to kind of play around. It was maybe loosely associated with conceptual studies, but in reality, it was actually really heavily on drawing. We took, you'd have to take like a full year of classical drawing and so on, and draw cadavers and dead bodies, and do still lifes and nude figure drawing. So I know how to do all that, which I don't really use much. But it is a way of understanding language. Really? Seriously? ViewSonic. Those are 3 birds I drew just the other day. I think the shading worked quite well. I didn't do the font, though. That's someone else. Okay, anyhow, back to it. The thing of drawing introduced this idea of language, of an individual's language and an individual's use of something. Just as everyone's handwriting is different, everyone's thoughts about something are different. Right, so that individual gesture, that individual way of interpreting something was, in a sense, this sort of individual authorship, this kind of modernizing thing, like that modern gesture of creation, of saying, yes, this is my opinion on something. And when I was in art school, it was the mid-'90s, and it was this height of sort of the postmodern hang-up on everything's been done, which someone like Hollis Frampton famously says that if it was worth doing once and it was good, that you may as well do it again. But at the same time, what that sort of also opens up for the individual is that just because someone else has done it or someone else has done this sort of thing, like I haven't done that. It's not my language that's describing that subject. And I think that looking back on that, because hindsight's fun, you start picking up on that, the way in which you can talk about something and construct an understanding of this thing, that subject, and how that translates into an object is a way of producing difference. So this work here, this is just from this past year, and they're photographs of an arm that's been painted up with black and white stripes, right? And how it was done is I found someone with a very long, thin arm. A short, stubby arm wouldn't do on this one. I really wanted a long, thin one, so the lines would be more accentuated. And I had them kind of throw their arm around in these gestures for about an hour and a half, and just took photographs and photographs. And what I wound up was this sort of alphabet of movement, of characterization of gesture. And I think the title is A Structure for Language Mapped Onto an Organic Form, or something along that pretentious line. And really what it was is, how can you come up with a way of understanding something that you can't understand, which is an organic thing, something that grows and has a life of its own, right? Where just the basic act, like that sort of intentioned act of describing something already begins to order how that object or that subject exists, because you have to begin at a point and you have to end at a point. And within that, that becomes the description of this thing. But then your description is also different from someone else's description. If we all drew a dog, they would all be different looking dogs. To put it one way. So this was very much something as simple as a kind of A and B thing of black and white, of stripes that, when it records movement, go from horizontal to vertical to diagonal. And it starts to read as more of an image. It starts to read as a kind of abstraction, as a kind of numeric language, almost like a 1 and 0 thing. Where each gesture produces a relationship between very simple things. So, I thought it was kind of a nice idea. Seems okay. But, again, that, structure onto an organic thing. Now this is a piece. It's called The Flute of Sub. And I'm talking about this one particularly because I've only ever done really 2 residencies. This is my second one. My first one was in the north of Scotland. I have something with being isolated, I guess. I don't know what it is. But I was in this tiny town called Lumsden in the north of Scotland, in Aberdeenshire. And the place is called the Scottish Sculpture Workshop. And I was there for a month. And artists were brought in to experiment with casting, right? Like pouring bronze and metal. And I'm not a big bronze guy. I did pewter instead, because you could do it on your kitchen stove, which is much more interesting for me. I don't know. It seems, you could cast pewter on the go, for example. But I was there for about a week. And, I was there for a month. And after the first week, I asked the director, because I was getting quite bored, is there any weird shit in this area? She's like, what do you mean? It's like, I don't know, like underground tunnels or caves or, I don't know, weird things that elves hang out in or something. Because I'm from Canada, right? And, I don't know, we don't really have that stuff. And she said, well, yes, of course. We have these underground tunnels called Souterrain circles, between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. And so I was like, great, can I go and see them? And she said, yes, you can. There's this guy named Peter Smith. He'll pick you up at 8 a.m. and you'll do a day trip and you'll drive around and see this stuff. So we did that. And yeah, there are these underground tunnels between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. Basically, no one knows why they're there. Scientists and archaeologists cannot agree. But when you're in there, when you're below the ground, it's distinctly different than when you're above the ground. And it feels very different. And they're made of massive pieces of stone. I'm 6'3". We're dealing inches here, right? In Belgium, it's centimeters. No one knows what the hell that means. They're like, what are you, that big? But I could stand fully upright and spread out my arms, which is, quite an odd thing for an underground form that's about 3,000 years old. Anyhow, and it was sort of like, okay, you're looking at these things, and a lot of people have looked at these things, and I wanted to find a way of treating the existence of this thing as a material. Right, so not to write a story to tell you what it's about, but instead construct something that acknowledges the existence of information as material and then uses that information as if it was a kind of sculptural material to build something. So what I came up with was the flute. The one tunnel I had an entrance and an exit, and I mapped out the dimensions of it. The note holes for the flute were based on the rabbit holes dug through the top of the ceiling of this tunnel. So it's as if this model flute, which I made out of a PVC pipe that I learned to make on YouTube, because craftsmen were completely useless in assisting me. They told me it was impossible to do this. And then some dude with dreadlocks on YouTube showed me how to do it in 4 minutes, which was great. And it's cost 50 cents piece of PVC tubing that you use for plumbing. So, but it's this thing of like, okay, this tunnel and like sort of stuff moving tunnel and being inside that tunnel and entering and exiting that tunnel. So it was really about, can I find some analog in the real world that exists already? So it became this sort of equivalency to a flute, to an instrument, to make that voice active, that voice that I am projecting onto this form, that sort of existence of that form and that history now has a way of sort of communicating. So within that, I developed a kind of ghost story, love story about this tunnel, and it became a performance. It's 10 minutes in total, 5 minutes storytelling, 5 minutes flute recital. Within that region of northern Scotland, there's this big investment in like sort of old pagan lore and mythology and mysticism, which is essentially establishing landscape or Mother Nature or Earth as a character, and relating to that character on a one-to-one level, and producing something like song as a way of acknowledging and representing and recording what that individual or that group, that sort of pagan group, would see within their environment. And that has influenced music through the years, from the emergence of psych folk into psych rock and to sort of contemporaneous examples around the world. So this whole, again, these were all the things I was thinking about while I was in that tunnel, and I wanted to sort of make this thing that could actually encounter all of that. So this is sort of how it was displayed afterwards. I made this sort of brown cave with felt in this wall, and I'd play the flute, and this is it. And so, and this is actually it. So I'm gonna play segments, and I'll jump around a bit, just because I don't think we need to watch the full 10 minutes. The flute, if we want to make it in under 40. By Zin Taylor. Can we turn it up? Sound man. A thin path through a field smelling of earth and animal leads to a tight circle of trees. Within this dark ring sits a dwelling that has existed here for the last 2,500 years. An underground form built from rock. The forested island is guarded by a low stone wall, then made complicated by a loose barbed wire fence. If you have a story, upon entering the circle, the wind muffles, like someone turned the volume down on nature. The trees protectively extend several stories into the sky, filtering the light and cooling the air. Hares populate this isolated forest. Because of the remote location, the hares have burrowed an elaborate warren, a maze of tunnel that is both entrance and exit to an underground community. The size of hole allowing one kind of being to enter while keeping another kind out. So, it's as if the form has soared a bit. Sorry. Yeah. Or referring to a circle of people who gather in ceremony. We're going to go deep down inside. So, okay, now we're inside the tunnel. Carefully interlocking, they have remained this way for longer than 25 centuries. Sparse streams of light spot the darkness of the form. Their source is a number of holes the hares have dug through the ceiling. Minor tributaries of a larger artery buried beneath the ground. The atmosphere below the ground is distinctly different from the atmosphere above. And I would suggest that the conversations occurring while in the circle are different from what was discussed while out. The walls, ceiling, floor, and length of the form have recorded the conversations that have occurred here before. These details have been translated into measurements, and an object has been made. This is the flute. The shape and sound of this flute is something like a living organism. This is the first entrance, and this is the second. The fingering holes are determined by the minor entrances the hairs have burrowed into and out of the tunnel. These are its notes. I was relieved that it sounded okay after I made it. By association, this flute's voice is the voice of the tunnel. An object to talk about an object. And I'm going to use it to tell a story. Playing this flute is to sing the song of sub. So we'll hear a little bit of the song, and I'll sort of take it off. I have a website you can watch all this stuff on anyhow when you're bored on a Sunday afternoon. So, and so on, you kind of go into the tunnel and you come back out and a small moth flies through the air in slow motion. It's all really beautiful. So actually, okay, and this is a work, it was the first performance I ever did. I think it's really one of the only ones. But it just sort of had to be done that way, right? You know, I mean, you had to see the flute and you had to see the flute being played, you know, that this thing had been constructed out of thoughts about a subject and turned into a form was really important, I thought. So whenever it's exhibited, the work always gets performed at least once, usually at the opening. At the very beginning, during the length of the entire opening, I just played it on a loop, basically. Like, I was the loop. Every 10 minutes, I'd play it with a 5-minute break. So we played it like 9 or 10 times during the course of the opening. Yeah, and I had guests come in and read the story off of the screen too, which is why it's always subtitled. But it's really about a story and about announcing a history and reading a history, and that's sort of important. So yeah, that was 2007. Now this piece here, this is 2005. This is a still from a video. There's also a booklet called The Allegorical Function of Dirt, a discussion with Akitsuyoko's Ongugashitsu. And Akitsuyoko's album, Ongugashitsu, was something I had had for about 6 years. It was this album of glockenspiel instrumental music. And I always felt that the music was soundtracking a kind of landscape. Like keep those albums and it sounds like, you can sort of imagine things going on. And I really wanted to find, actually, for years, I wanted to make that film. I thought it'd be a fun thing to make. I thought it'd be an interesting thing to make. But I didn't really have enough of an approach to really go at it. And then it was years later, after thinking about it quite a bit, that sort of came up with the proposition that it's as if Akitsuyoko uses instruments to mold the formless material of sound into arrangements of songs. So, that glockenspiel or that organ, that's her mediator for this thing that just will exist in many forms all over the place, which is just sound, which is language. All right. Actually, what comes out is an example of language. It becomes a usage of that material. So a kind of sculptural or material equivalent for me was dirt. It's this thing that sort of exists everywhere. No matter what you do to it, you can't really take it over allegorically and replace its meaning with something else. It will always be dirt. It will always be the ground. So I made 12 sculptures for 12 songs, then shot them in video with this kind of shot-counter-shot thing, right? That it's this convention of narrative dialogue used in television, where if you frame something in three-quarter view and then sort of alternate back and forth, you can imply that narrative is occurring between objects or space. So I did that, and I sent it to her, and I asked her what she thought, and I sort of wrote her this long letter, and then our correspondence was then recorded in this booklet that existed alongside of it. So how it was installed, it was as if you would walk into this room, and there'd be this kind of discussion between Akitsuyoko and I, with the video and the sound together, and you could walk in and out of that conversation. You could never sit and watch the full 62-minute video. I mean, who would? Unless you were high or, you couldn't leave. Right? And for me, it had this nice equivalency to what an actual conversation with someone would be if you went for 62 minutes about one subject. It could be interesting, it could be boring, it could be silly, it could be sloppy and dirty, it could be irrelevant, it could be offensive, you could just disagree. And within the work, within this video, that all those things are kind of represented in a way. And the visuals that are constructed as a response to the music allude to many, many sort of points in history, just by accident or just not so much intentional, but that's what I found in making it. I was constructing visuals just through the process of shooting something that we're talking about things that happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago in film and TV and so on. So this was the booklet, this little newsprint, little thing that you could take away. This is one of the sculptures. This is sort of a shot, like a studio shot. I destroyed all the sculptures afterwards, and they were never shown and would never be shown. I mean, it's about the video. It's about this relationship between the audio and the visual. Any kind of object thing just seemed like I was pimping it out or something. So this is, I'll just play I'm not playing the 60 minutes, but this is basically what it's like. That's track one. I'll bounce around a bit. Yeah, I do. It's quite goofy music. In an interview she did around the time of the release of the album, and there were only 1,000 copies made of this album. It was quite a low release. She's quite an unknown musician, and it's kind of why I wanted to pick it in a way. It's like me as an audience member, just me a member of the public, and someone releases an album, and I get to think about that album. And instead of sort of passively engaging with it, I decided to make something as a response, to sort of talk back to something and not just consume, to have an opinion and to produce some sort of different story or different place for this thing that could exist within. This is one of those songs, when I heard it, I had no idea what you could possibly make to illustrate this song. And then this was, I think, one of the most difficult ones to sort of interpret. Because I did really interpret them in that way. It's like, well, these highs and low pitches will make mountains and stuff. And this was like, the fuck is this? It's just like, and it's called Wafting, too. That's the title, right? I mean, come on. Yeah, I was just sort of out of experimentation in the studio one day as I was zooming in on light bulbs. And I was like, oh yeah, maybe we'll do that. And this image just sort of like, just breaks away over and over again. This was like an 8-minute song. I had no idea what to do. So I did a puppet show. Like, making dirt interesting on one song for 8 minutes? No way. So I just built this tunnel and like, and then, I mean, what wound up happening was actually being able to produce a 62-minute video that's incredibly watchable. It's like birth of the universe. Last song I didn't like, so I just wrote out the text of the full moon and a long night and just set it on the table, and that was it. So this is me disagreeing. It's really like I don't like it, which was fitting because the conclusion to the correspondence I had with Akitsuyoka was she's like, I don't really get it. After seeing the video, I don't know why you did this. It's funny. Thanks, I think. Which is really great. It's one of those things that's like, yeah, okay, you're going to make this, you're going to do this, you're going to think so long about this, and you send it out, they're like, yeah, I don't care. Which is nice. I think it's nice, right? I mean, that was one of these issues of relational aesthetics and so on from a couple years ago, where it's just like this idea of participation. And the easiest way to like poke a giant hole through that whole thing was like, well, what if you just don't participate? What if you don't care? Like, if the point of what someone's doing is about you caring, well, if you just don't care, or maybe you don't even hear it properly, or maybe you're deaf and you can't hear it all, then that content's gone. It's eliminated. It's incredibly fascist to make people do things. I think you always have to be able to disagree. And then you need to make space for that disagreement to exist within, which I think is maybe what a lot of art is doing in some way or another. Not being overtly political, but just the fact that now you disagree, this could be done differently. And it comes out that way. All right, moving on. So, and then this is a couple years ago. Okay, so from that was like engaging this sort of public thing. Right, like an album that someone could buy and producing a story, and then that whole thing around there that is producing a different place for that album to exist within. And then the flute was this sort of this publicly accessible underground tunnel that's very much of the lore of the region. So I did those, and I wanted to get weirder. So I did this thing called The Bakery of Block, and it's a children's television series. About pieces of wood that come alive in an abandoned bakery and start interpreting their environment to produce tools And using these tools, they use their surroundings to start making bread. And then the bread becomes alive and starts talking. And the wood speaks the sound of wood, and the bread speaks the sound of bread. And through the episodes, they develop forms. And then these forms develop other forms. And this thing, a dough ball, like a sourdough starter, is this sort of infinitely generating device, like memory or history. And I think this one really came about when I moved to Europe a couple of years ago, or Belgium in particular, which is a very odd country. Very wonderful. I love it more than anything. There's a kind of dark surrealism to things, Gothic elegance that I enjoy a lot. But one of these things was this sort of tradition of bread making, right? That you have some starters that are hundreds of years old, and the fact is you need to work them continually. So if you get married, you got to make bread. Get divorced, you got to make bread. There's a war going on, you're still making bread. And it was this thing of sort of transference, right? That all this stuff is going on. All this stuff's going on in your head, too, but you're still making bread. And you're still making these units of bread. They're going to a bakery. And someone's buying those units. And they're coming back the next day, and they're going to buy more. And then they might come in the afternoon and buy even more because they're hungry. When you keep making it, it's this material that just keeps generating. But the fact is, it's like it may look the same, but what's happening at that moment is never the same. It's always different. Things happen. And it was this sort of insinuation that because those things happen, because these units, these standard little, units of measurement are being made, and they're supposed to be identical, they're not really identical. There's something to them. And so the project was really about trying to build up a world where all those kind of variables get represented in an allegorical, metaphorical kind of way. And I think at a similar time period, I had read an article about Pingu, that Swiss-Italian claymation with the penguin that speaks gibberish. Did people know Pingu? Yeah, okay, right, it's a grand unifier, right? And what was even more unifying about Pingu was in this article, it stated that it was technically the most economically successful television program in the world because you never had to overdub it. You can't overdub gibberish. You can't subtitle gibberish, right? So as a result of that, it became wildly economically successful and made loads of money, which was a nice sort of situation to be in, right? Where it's like, put it this way, the more abstract you are and unclear with what you're trying to communicate, the wider audience you'll be able to reach, which kind of goes against basic logic in a sense, but maybe not. So instead it's like, okay, well, let's produce a situation where abstraction and projection, where a person's ability to interpret something is what we're kind of going after, is actually a way of communicating more completely. So I went about trying to do that. So I started making tools for making bread, and really it was about, getting this list of bread instruments, and I would just make them. Like, okay, I'm going to make a spoon now. I'm going to make a scale, and so on. And then weights, because you have to measure out this stuff, right? So I just made weights from the leftover pieces of wood that were left after carving and building these containers and tools, right? These are some of the containers, right? And then, so this is one of the episodes. And in this episode, this is from the first season. There's 23 episodes in total. There's 8 pilot episodes, and then there's 15 episodes of the first season. And at that point, I was doing a show in Toronto, Ontario, at my gallery there, and that was where the pilot episodes were, because it's a smaller market. And then in New York, 4 months later, my gallery there, I did the first season, because that's like the big show, because it's New York. Like, what the fuck? I don't know. It's just incredibly scary to do a show in New York. It was for me, anyhow. So it's not, and then what you do is that you kind of cannibalize the pilots to produce the first season, which is just sort of how television shows work in the world, anyhow. And it was one of those ready-made structures that you get to kind of walk into and think about and interpret and produce your own version of. So in this one, the dough ball of memory is discovered, and then some whacked-out stuff happens. You have to have a title sequence, and you have to have a theme song. diagram for making bread. It's an ideogram. That's good. It happens. It's like cave drawings. Oh, look, you missed the measurement. Oh, okay, I guess that's flat. Oh. Yeast. Obviously. Happens. And subsequently, after seeing this, while she's showing this, some friends of mine, people, like colleagues of mine, quite ceremoniously coined my genre of video making as stoner video. So, but this, that metaphor of the dough ball of memory, right? That thing that just exists with all these thoughts in it, because it's been touched so much, became a kind of organism. So I did these photos called organisms, right? Which is really, it's one piece of dough that every time I needed it, I took a photograph and then turned it again and took another photograph. So the same thing, its shape was continually changing and adjusting, and each one representing a kind of form. So I would, take that photo, pump it into Photoshop, and just playing with like contrast values, really, that's all that this is. These things would just sort of come out, right? And then for the exhibition, producing these examples of weights, measures, tools, right, on these blocks with this series. So this sort of integrated sculptural thing, like everything is sort of creating itself. It's existing in space, but it's also depicted within this narrative that's going on. All, sort of set upon the floor in front of this sort of portrait of an organism, as if these things are kind of manifested from it. Right, so this is another arrangement, right? So each arrangement of these objects, all these things make the same thing. They all do the same thing, but it's different examples of it, right? It's like a different way of pronouncing those same words. This is another one again. So, right? See, same piece of dough, different look and shape. So and after that, because it was a kind of an incredibly complex project to explain over and over, and I wanted to make stuff where I didn't have to talk at all, where I actually had almost nothing to say about it. Because I had spent so long really constructing these ways of explaining and interpreting the world. It's like, why not we just do these really simple, back to basics kind of things. And this was where this sort of series of wood and dust came out of. And it's pieces of wood. They're all 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter lengths that I get from the hardware store that I cut up, paint different colors, arrange into shapes, and make something kind of formally interesting. And then put dust on it, sort of interact. So I started sort of saving dust into a box, and that became these embellishing moments within these very primary form, very, very formal things. One way of looking at it is that each piece of wood is like a word. So each structure's a sentence, and or a statement, and you say that statement, and then as it's thought about, that thought is then represented as this kind of debris-like growth that exists that exists upon it. These, I guess, as works, they're just 8 by 10 photographs. They're quite small, like A4. It's the frog in the arch, it's called. So, I think it's like Neighbors by a Fence, I think it's called. I don't know. And then sort of along those lines as well, I was doing these drawings called Growth on a Form, which were these imaginary sculptures of wood, things I would just sort of make it up, and I would sort of draw it. And then it's like sort of drawing an idea or drawing a statement or drawing this thing in space, this subject. And then as that subject exists, it becomes more sort of aestheticized, or it becomes thought about in a certain way. So it starts to adopt things like sort of eyeball-like painting, or then this debris-like globular poo lump filth object that sort of becomes its sidekick, or 5 of them with their own little sidekicks, and so on. It's called the Candy Man. You know, leading those kids away, little filth ball. You know, and these are, for me, they're almost like infinitely more interesting than the bakery stuff or the dirt video, because they're almost like self-portraits of what I do in a way. It's like you've got a form, and then you think about that form, and how do you record those thoughts, right? A good friend of mine sort of described as growth was this term that could be used to describe what the work is that I do relative to what I think about, because it represents like what you see as a manifestation of thought in a way. Elephant, snowman. This was actually made, the image is derived from a really shitty ice cream bar from Mexico that a friend of mine took a photo of and I think put on Facebook or something. I was going through, it's like, oh my God, that image is amazing. It's this sort of drip face thing, right? It's just, this is where my drawing skills worked out well or something from art school. 20 years old. No, I'm not that old. Yeah, there's a bunch of them, and these are just infinitely fun to do. And this leads, okay, and this is just a couple months ago. This is my brings us up to the present, and we're getting really close to the end, so I'm probably way over 45 minutes. But it's coming up tight. And for this show, it was called The Voids. And the void, the idea of the void for me was very much about a place where you go into, and there's nothing there, but everything you think about takes on shape. Right, which again, sort of in thinking about the flute, or we're thinking about the album from Akitsuyoko and the dirt video that was done. Right, it's like thoughts about a subject turning into form. And then the Bakery of Block, a similar thing. It's like I have all these ideas about sculpture and history and memory, and how memory and history of materials and how they get manifested into a form and then animated or used in such a way to tell a story. Right, and you're talking. So. With the show, I wanted to produce something where you didn't have to know anything. And there's nothing for you to know either. So for the installation, it was you would just walk in, and there were these 5 vitrines, all with a series of objects on them. Hands, knives, spectacles, instruments, and then just forms. Right, so this was the hands. And this was, I think it's like 18 thoughts about a hand manifested into a form arranged on a vitrine made of brass and glass, which is exactly what it is. You think about a hand, then you make that hand. Then you think about the hand again and make another hand. And it's like, how can you depict that word, that one thing, over and over and over and over again? Set within a sort of like a kind of hierarchy of display, which is this very sort of modernist vitrine-like thing, brass being a 20th century invention, basically. For decoration. It's an alloy. It's all about presenting something, right? So for me, the brass structure became the word hand, and everything in it was just hands. And when I was explaining at the time, right, trying to it's like this idea of the familiar, that when you're familiar with something, difference is easily identified. It became this sort of mainline way of addressing the production of difference and options for something. People use language very specifically to their own ends at times, right? People use the word democracy to kill people, right? Or they can use that word to help people. That's kind of but those are some of the things you think about. The other one was, say, going to someone lends you their house, and you go there, right? And it's a house, and you know it's a house. You know there's a toilet, you know there's a bedroom, you know there's a front door, You know you're going to have the key to lock that door. You know there's going to be a kitchen, right? You can pretty much guess that these things are going to be there. How they're going to look, that's a whole other thing, but you know they're going to be there, right? And there's always that situation when someone lends you their place, or you go to some place, you're like, where the fuck are the forks? Can't find that thing. You know, what's going on? How do you turn the hot water on? Exactly, but you know you can, but you need to sort of figure it out. And that was one of these things I was kind of like was thinking about. So these are the instruments. You can they were all shakers. They all made sounds. These were just forms, random things. Knives. These were 38 thoughts about a knife. So it's just like you said, back to the hands, right? And which is originally the photograph I started out with. I couldn't figure out a way that I liked the photos for a bit, so I started making sculptures of the photos. That's out of plaster. More instruments. Spectacles, just eyeglasses. They all fit me too. I can wear them all. So these were the knives. Those are some nice pocket knives in the back, some folding ones I figured out how to make. Pretty good. Getting stabbed by a polka dot knife, right? And I think with each of these, there's a level of humor and absurdity to it, but it's almost like, okay, you got a knife. You say knife, you make a knife, and then you finish it, right? You put a kind of character to it, which is what sort of the polka dots are, or like this red little demon thing, or this sort of green mossy psych knife, or this elemental primary color folding pocket Swiss Army knife thing, or like this long thing in the middle, right? For me, artworks are propositions, right? They're a kind of statement of what you think. And each one of these knives, or each one of these objects, they're a kind of character. Like each one is a statement about what a knife could be. And it takes this word like proposition and sort of really messes with it poorly, I think, and turns it into the word prop. Like they're a prop for you to use to think about, or they're a prop to engage with. And it's there. They're arranged for your use upon a structure that's built for your engagement. More knives, all plaster. Gold knife. So on, right? So, same with the hands, right? If each one of those arms or hands was connected to a person that matched it, you get a real spooky cast of characters made out of wood, thin plaster striped arms. Creepy. Someone's playing in the purple. Then then I did some block prints out of it. I might skip over these. These were called arrangements of voids, and it's kind of complex. This one's a bit more, but it's sort of that thing of advertising imagery, that sort of space. Like if you take a magazine cover and you draw just an outline around where the text is, like where the headlines are and the title and where the image is, each one of those becomes a kind of space for content to be projected into. And those became kind of interesting organic forms for me. So I made up a kind of alphabet of these forms, of like backgrounds and of portraits and of titles and of smaller bits and where you would put the data in. So there's always just these shapes, and they're really just random looking, really simple geometric shapes. And starting with black paper, I would ink them up in white and build up this ground, right? Where the more information you put on, the blanker the page became. The more options there were for information to be put within it, like posters for the future or something. And I think it's sort of like seen within a series. You can sort of see how the forms get repeated over and over and used. And this is a photo I took last night. This is sort of what I've done here, in a way. Which has taken up this thing of sort of horizontals and verticals of stripes and dots, where a stripe, when looked at head-on, is a dot, and a dot, when looked at the side, is a stripe. And these were actually, they're tree roots. I called them sea fingers because I was really tired the first day I got here, and Seamus took me down to Strand Hill, and it was in the ocean. And these things were just sort of hanging around, and I really love these sort of creepy, penis-like organic forms that you find all over the world. And so I eventually went and collected a bunch of these creepy penis-like forms and dried them out in the studio here, and almost gassed myself doing it. Because there's a lot of weird stuff these things absorb. But the roots, and they kind of dry down this way. And so it's like, it's this found form that you sort of, for some psychotherapeutic reason, you find an interest in, right? And it became, well, let's patternate this. Let's put a kind of logic onto the outside in which to understand that form. So it became sort of stripes and polka dots. And then let's suspend these like they're hanging out, like they're talking, or maybe these forms are communicating in such a way. Photography for me has always been about the study of something, especially black and white photography. It's the only way an image can ever exist in black and white is in photographic form, which is formally kind of interesting for me. Also, I'm really shitty at color correction, so black and white makes it really simple. So this is a series that will come out, and it's this new work called The Story of Stripes and Dots. And it's working with patternation and surface, and how that surface represents the form from underneath. If you look at how pattern is used in clothing, and clothing is used as just a way of representing fashion or personality. Well, fashion as a personality. I mean, no one here is wearing the same piece of clothing for a very specific reason. It's because you are not all the same person. And you make choices, and how are those choices represented, and how does that form a language of the individual? And then, of course, art historically, you've got this whole thing of stripes and dots with Mossad and Barin. But I mean, it really comes out of that sort of situationist thing of the 60s of someone's representation being boiled down to this very iconic graphic of a stripe or a dot. But stripes and dots exist everywhere. I mean, stripes, for me, horizontals are narrative and verticals are gesture. You can't have a narrative without beginning, which is a gesture. You can't end that narrative without a gesture, which is then a vertical. And dots are almost like these statements and these points. But the history of the circle, the history of the dot, or just the history of the shape zero came out of trying to identify the void and to give a shape to the void, which was just drawing a circle around nothing, and so on. Oh, we got a question. Cool.
It's not a question, it's just an aside.
Okay.
See, it looks like the painting that the two Aborigines drew on the wall of the museum at the beginning of David Bowie's Let's Dance.
Yeah? Nice.
Just if you ever happen to see it.
That's a good aside. Last Dance? I'm done. I like you. Yeah. Well, there we go. I mean, that's kind of it, right? I mean, like, stripes and dots they're pretty ubiquitous. They're pretty everywhere. It's this it's like the alphabet, or it's like black and white. It's this thing. But then how do you kind of choreograph that thing? How do you choreograph that thing to represent an idea? Or your own your thoughts about something? How did that turn into a form? And we're done. Thank you for hanging out.